Hello. Welcome to the Objective Epistemology Podcast. My podcast series explores ideas and concepts pertaining to how humans come to know what they think they know about reality and how individuals objectively discover knowledge. As this podcast develops, I will spend time explaining why epistemology should matter to all individuals and why mastering this skill set will separate you from the individuals that decide to remain ignorant of this subject matter, or the individuals that willfully reject objectivity for a subjectivist, nihilistic, altruistic, relativistic, or some other anti-pseudo-epistemology. In episode 1, I will read and discuss an article written by, I'm probably going to not say these names all that wonderful throughout this article, but here's our first name. Elisa Sloan Perry, that wasn't too bad, and Aja, Couchois, Couchois Duncan, and their attempt to sell multiple ways of knowing. So this entire article is trying to convince you that there are multiple ways of getting to knowledge, but I don't think that's exactly what they are meaning. I think that they mean that there can be multiple knowledges that contradict each other and that all of them are valid, but we'll get into that. First, I'm an individualist. I do not associate with any particular political party. You can call me politically homeless. My goal is to remain as objective as I am capable of remaining and to promote the virtues of the ideals of individualism. Let's get to this article, hopefully the first of many to come. Before we continue, though, let's define a few terms. Number 1, objectivity is the disposition of remaining neutral to bias and pursuing to understand reality by its nature and how that can be a guiding decision maker for all individuals. Number 2, epistemology is the philosophical study of how humans come to know what they claim to know. Epistemology helps people decide the difference between what they believe to be true and what is actually true. Number 3, individualism is a disposition that recognizes that the individual human is the only kind of human that exists. There is no such entity as a collective consciousness or tribal entity. Individualists recognize that the individual is the smallest and most persecuted minority group on earth. The article we're going to discuss was written April 27th, 2017. Multiple Ways of Knowing, Expanding How We Know. Written by Elisa Sloan Perry and Aja Couchois Duncan. I'm going with that. Starts with a quote. A beauty of art is simultaneity, multiple truths being allowed to exist. What would happen if the world could live with that? Multiple truths existing. Sharon Brightforth and Ami Jones. So right away when I look at this or start reading it, when it says multiple truths being allowed to exist, seems like a giveaway that they kind of know that this is bullshit. Objectivity is key. It's very important. If you can recognize that truth exists as an idea or a concept outside of anyone's desires or anyone's brain or mind, feelings, everything changes. And so people can pretend like they have their own truth, but that's not reality. There is truth, and anyone employing a proper epistemology or scientific method can discover that truth. So just this quote right off the bat is going to be a telling thing for the rest of this article. Next, we have italicized portion here that kind of explains where this kind of came from and what the meaning of this whole thing is. It says the Management Assisting Group, MAG, M-A-G, is one of the NPQ's go-to sources of information about, of course, social justice movement or communism. MAG works with a number of the networks that are moving some of the nation's most difficult issues. MAG has come to believe there are 5 elements that are critical, there's that word, to advancing a thriving justice ecosystem. This is the third in a special 5-part series in which MAG and NPQ invite you to contribute to the evolution of what these elements mean in practice. Let's start something. So right off the bat, at least they're kind of being honest. They're telling you that this is about social justice, and that's one of those buzzwords. When you hear it, you either love it or you're like me and you hear this is how we're going to try to impose communism on you and likely erode your constitutional American rights. So that's the first thing I hear when I hear social justice, because anytime you have to put a word in front of justice, you should probably listen and figure out what their actual meaning is. I think we're into the meat of it now. Here it goes. Have you ever had an encounter with the world, one that reaches right into your brain, your heart, and your gut, and radically alters the way you think? Ooh, whenever they use the word radical. Feel and act. This is the terrain of multiple ways of knowing. Right off the bat, they're trying to pretend like there are multiple truths out there. They're putting it in the perspective of heart, gut, feelings, and brain. See, that brain is the thing that they just start with because everyone knows that that's where rationality begins, but then they're trying to equate that heart, gut, and feelings are all equally important. Kind of gross. There's a strong bias in the U.S. dominant culture. There's that word dominant culture. It's another buzzword. One that shows up in the nonprofit sector as well, to value only one way of knowing, the one grounded in data, analysis, logic, and theory, a rationalist's approach to truth. But there are many different ways to understand and engage with the world. These other ways of knowing are equally meaningful and are critical to our effort to understand complexity and create the possibility for transformational societal change. Wow. So that right off the bat, a ton of buzzwords. Critical is likely talking about the critical theories. This is part of the Marxist doctrine. They just talk about everyone expecting that data, analysis, logic, and theory. What kind of theory? These are all rationalist approaches. So they're trying to put people that are rational in their own little camp over here. So what this lets me know is that this whole thing is not going to be based on rationality. And so that is, I'm going to use their word, problematic. So Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. described justice as moving toward the public manifestation of love. Sorry, Mr. King, that's a deepity. To publicly manifest love, we must incorporate all of our ways of knowing. Don't know what that means, but we're going to figure it out, I'm sure. They're going to tell us. Dr. King's modeled this by bringing his own experience and faith. What he learned from the faith of others, his scholarship, and deep cultural traditions of music and song, together with theory and action, to advance a vision of love and justice. I don't think these people actually like Martin Luther King, but we'll just let this one go. This is a framework for understanding. So this is the main beginning, I suppose. To help us grapple with the multitude of practices and embrace the many ways of knowing, and to bring greater clarity to the impact of integrating them into our social justice work. So they need these other ways of knowing, otherwise they don't have anything, because unless they can just pretend like the bullshit that they make up is just as important as actual science or actual knowledge, none of this is going to make any sense. We begin using extended epistemology. I guess that's going to be a type of epistemology that they're going to make up. A theory developed by Peter Reason and John Heron. This theory categorizes 4 interdependent ways of knowing: experiential knowing, presentational knowing, propositional knowing, and practical knowing. So they're going to compartmentalize all of these different types of knowing. Now see, that wouldn't necessarily be a problem if we were using those kinds of knowing to get to truth that is objective and outside of any one person's personal wants or desires. And so if we were using these to discover the truth, that would be fine. But that's not what they're talking about, and that's not what they want you to know. This theory has been useful in thinking about the wisdom that is critical, there's that word, to harness, affect meaningful societal change. We're going to hear this societal change, meaningful societal change, which means they want the power. They want society to bend a knee to their way of knowing that is just as good as the scientific or rational way of knowing, but their way is going to basically become the new way of knowing, because they're going to beat the old way into submission later, because we're going to find out the old way is colonized, colonial, and that's never okay when we're talking to Marxists. But there are other elements of knowing, such as what we learn from, here we go, indigenous ancestral wisdom, and the natural world that we, along with our parents, clients, and people we interviewed for this article, have found important to lift up in more pronounced ways. As a result, we have developed the framework to better understand and act in meaningful and interdependent ways in the world. So right off the bat, a big part of what they really want to push in this article is indigenous ancestral wisdom. So they're going to try to prop up these old traditional things that people used to replace actual knowledge with before they had knowledge. It's like when Richard Dawkins talks about the gap of the gods. And so anytime people don't know something, they just say, it must be God's will, or God did it. And it doesn't really explain anything. It's kind of a deepity. It's like it sounds like it should be important, but when you actually go to investigate why it's important, it all just disintegrates and falls apart. So indigenous ancestral wisdom, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that if what that wisdom actually discovered was the truth, like objective truth, the thing that we talk about being outside of anybody's desires, wishes, or opinions. If indigenous ancestral wisdom actually sees that, and we can just call it knowledge, but they can't just call it knowledge because it defeats the purpose of their whole motive here. So the other way of knowing, when they're going to try to put on a pedestal indigenous ancestral wisdom that doesn't meet modern science, modern ways of knowing the truth, this is another kind of knowing that doesn't actually equate to the same truth. And so they want these people who have these ancestral wisdoms, they want to erect them to the same value on the hierarchy. That's what this paper is kind of about. There's a lot of this in here. It says the framework like extended epistemology. So they're trying to extend how we know things to include other ways of knowing. So those other ways of knowing are probably not coming to truth. They're coming to some postmodern, some subjectivist, or some nihilistic view of the world where nothing is knowable. And that's what they want you to feel is incapable of knowing actual truth, because we're going to find out that is colonialism. And if you know Marxists, they hate colonialism because it puts a lie to their philosophy. So we're looking at a diagram here, and there's arrows going north, south, east, and west. To the north, it says practical knowing. It says previous actions, generalized knowing into practice. So we go west, it's artistic knowing, creating representations through story, visual arts, movement, and music. And to the east, generalized knowing, experiments creating concepts, academic theory, logic models, and promising practices. And of course, south, foundational knowing, says experiential, indigenous, ancestral, spiritual, and natural. So these are the directions that knowledge supposedly takes. So instead of them all pointing towards the center where knowledge is a thing that anyone can acquire because knowledge exists by itself, knowledge is just objective. It's always been there. Anyone who uses the proper method to discover it can be enlightened by that knowledge. But this is not what this chart shows. It shows all the arrows going in opposite directions because they don't think that there is an objective truth. Because if there were, it would put a lie to a lot of what they're saying. And that hurts them, makes them very sad. You can tell. So right off the bat, foundational knowing. There are at least three major foundations for how we make sense of the world: experience, indigenous ancestral wisdom, and spiritual natural wisdom. So again, artistic knowing, to understand our experiences and to help others understand them. We create representations through story, visual art, movement, music, etc. I'm a music teacher. I love all those things, but I can promise you, you can do those things and point to objective truth. But I don't think that's what they're looking for. I think that they want to use this as sophistry to confuse you or to trick you into believing that there are other truths that are not objective, that are just as equally important. Yuck. I hate that. I hate people that do that. It's disgusting. Generalized knowing. We look at patterns and experiments to create concepts. This is where academic theory and propositions live, as well as theories of change, logic models, and promising practices. Well, duh, of course they're promising if you're doing logic and reason. Practical knowing says we act intentionally in the world in ways that are informed by our previous actions, as well as our generalized knowing. We take our generalizations and turn them into practices. Oh boy. So here comes the sophistry. Too often, we stay in generalized and practical knowing, rarely dipping into foundational knowing or artistic knowing in meaningful ways. By not intentionally drawing on these, our theories and action plans are often disconnected from our values and beliefs and the bedrock experiences of our lives. Moreover, privileging, it's another one of those buzzwords, privileging one way of knowing over others. For example, generalized knowing with its focus on measurable data marginalizes, that's a big buzzword, marginalizes and ignores other truths that people bring from other ways of knowing. They still haven't actually proven that other ways of knowing exist, and this is the game they play. It's shitty. They'll just pretend like what they've said is just already known to be true, and that you're a bad person because we already know this is true, and therefore by not allowing us to pretend like it's true, this marginalizes the people that want to use this other way of knowing that we haven't proven, but you have to pretend like we did. So that's where they're going with this. This marginalization often lies at the core of conflict, systemic barriers to change, and you guessed it, inequity. All these buzzwords. This marginalization often lies at the core. So this is the thing that they probably hate the most. The core of conflict between them wanting to take power and people pushing back saying what you're saying is bullshit. So systemic barriers. The system is erecting these barriers. Nope, it's objectivity, objective reality, or that's kind of a redundancy. Reality is the barrier to basically say, no, what you think is real isn't actually real because it's contradicting reality. But that's an inequity. So they don't like inequities because it puts a lie to what they are trying to weave into some disgusting tapestry of lies that they want to be in charge of. They're using it as a club to beat you with, but people don't want to let that happen. All right, foundational knowing. So they're jumping right in. This is like the one thing that they want this whole article to focus on. Foundational knowing consists of at least three fundamental ways of making sense of the world: experiential, indigenous, ancestral, and spiritual, natural. So experiential means you've had direct experience with something. Just because you think you've had an experience that actually is meaningful to progress of discovering knowledge, it doesn't just correlate. Just because you think you've had an experience with something doesn't always make it true. I know plenty of little kids that watch you take a straw and put it into a glass of water, and their experience tells them that straw is now bent in the water. And so if they were going to be using experiential circumstances as knowledge, they would be objectively wrong. And so that's not going to fly here. It says indigenous and ancestral. They still haven't decided to tell us why, because somebody is indigenous to an area or ancestral, which means old, equates to knowledge. So these are some of the fallacies. Just because somebody is old doesn't make them right. Just for the same reason, just because someone is young doesn't make them wrong. So this is where reason plays a role, and that you always have to listen to all old and young people to find out if their actual argument is valid and true, not just them saying, I'm an authority because I'm indigenous. That doesn't follow. I'm an authority because ancestral. That doesn't follow. So same thing with spiritual or natural. Just because people have a spiritual feeling about something or a belief, or it's been passed down that this is a spiritual place or event, doesn't constitute knowledge. It's not knowledge. Sometimes it is. Sometimes a spiritual practice can actually help to get us to actual knowing of objective truth. But just because it's spiritual doesn't make that true. So, experiential knowledge. So for Pamela Standing, director of the Minnesota Indian Business Alliance, experiential knowing is a wisdom enacted in our way of being with others, a way that looks deeply within another person and takes the time to see what that emerges, rather than reading another person based on what is immediately present. Okay, I think anybody who takes a moment to get to know somebody, that's just good practice. Doesn't mean that it has to be ancient wisdom or something. I think that that's just what normal people that really want to know if they're selecting a proper candidate for a job, they don't just rush through the interview. I mean, if they have the time to do it, you actually want to talk to the person and get to know them. All right. We are interested in the core of what people are about rather than their resume. Notes Standing. Native people call experiential knowing craft wisdom. So Native people do this too, and so when they give it a special name, then it belongs to the Native people. Craft wisdom. I think any reasonable person just does this. I don't think you need to be Native, or I don't think they have special claim to doing this, but okay. Says it's an ability that you carry. When I'm in a group with elderly people, I know that they may not have a formal education, that's an assumption, but they have a PhD in life. That's sedipity. It sounds important, but doesn't really mean anything. Says you can't learn that in a book, and can't learn that by going to college. So just because you're old doesn't mean that you're actually wise. There are a lot of really, really dumb old people who just did life bad. There was this guy I saw on the internet, where some lady was, an older lady was like trying to shame a bunch of people for not coming to see their parents in like old folks' homes. And she was like kind of an ass. And then this other dude replied to her on the internet, was like, I work in these old folks' homes. He's like, when these people are in these old folks' homes, these older people, and their kids don't come to see them, he's like, 99% of the time there's a reason for it. It's because parents were assholes and the kids don't want to come see them. But the parents are so narcissistic that they can't imagine that it's their fault for their kids not coming to see them. And they always project that it's the kid's problem or it's somebody else's problem. And so just because somebody's old doesn't mean they're wise or doesn't mean they're good. These are all fallacies, and I think it's disgusting. So I can't stand when I read this kind of stuff. It just pisses me off. But Standing, that's the lady, finds this way of knowing radically undervalues in context with less Native presence. So she's saying that this doesn't happen as much unless we get the Native people in power. We got to put the Native people in there. So recently, a partner was looking to convene a group of people and hoped for more Native attendees. Says, I told her that it would be hard to attract Native American people to an event if you have to have a college degree to be part of it. We don't make choices based on that. Okay, that doesn't really mean much. So whenever possible, this lady Standing tries to share different ways of knowing and being to encourage different approaches. She and people from 6 Anishinaabe bands in Minnesota brought scientists together to help them understand the impact genetic modifications of wild rice was having on native food staples. One inextricably linked to their way of life. We took them out rice harvesting, also called knocking the rice or manuminikuin, I guess that's their word for knocking rice, a practice that the Ojibwe people have been engaged in for centuries. So they could experience things differently. They were really moved. So they wanted to show, the native people from Minnesota, they wanted to bring scientists who actually do science. They wanted to bring them into the field and show them how the old native tribes of the area would gather the wild rice. And so the scientists were very moved to watch these people do their thing. I think most scientists would just be fascinated watching most people do things that have been done for a very long time. Even if people do those things in a very inefficient way, it's just fascinating to watch, be like, oh, I guess that's how they learn to do this stuff. None of this really gets to the point that genetic modifications to wild rice is actually a bad thing. They're just saying they want the people who have been doing it a certain way forever, which is another fallacy. Just because you've done something for a very long time a particular way doesn't make it the correct way to do things. Or it doesn't mean that there's not better ways to do things now. This paper is just rife with logical fallacies, one after another. It's the sophistry. It's sneaky and shitty. All right, so the scientist removed. Whoopee. From this experience, the scientists began to understand the impact of genetic modification on diet, nutrition, and traditional food gathering rituals, as well as their practice of what Standing, this lady, describes as going into tribal communities, just trampling all over the land and starting to take samples. So sharing their native worldview and Anishinaabe, I guess that's how you say it, life ways, notes Standing, deepened the respect. And in turn, it created a collaborative opportunity for addressing an environmental food system and indigenous rights issue to greater effect. Seems like what they really wanted was just to be seen, I guess. I guess everyone wants to be seen, but genetically modifying food isn't necessarily always environmentally good or bad. In many ways, genetically modified food has a smaller footprint because you feed more people, because the modified food produces more nutritious and more of the food. And so for them to say environmental food systems and indigenous rights, really think it's just because these Marxists and leftists don't like that, they don't want to tell the story that the indigenous people of Americas were all fighting one another and they were all pretty vicious. Some of them were cannibals, many of them were ruthless killers, some of them were just nice people. But because the colonizers came over and won, because we had high technology, this pisses them off. They feel like for some reason that the indigenous people still have a right even if they were conquered. They were conquered because they lost the war. So when you lose wars, that's what happens. Your culture often either assimilates or dies out. It's kind of sad, but that's been going on and with humans forever. I don't know why they would just... I kind of know why. This is all part of their way of undermining the entire Western system. They don't like that science came from liberal Enlightenment values of objectivity, reason. When you look at the Enlightenment, there was a rebirth of knowledge, of rational knowledge, of objective knowledge. And so that puts a lie to these people, these Marxists, getting power. And this is all a power grab. So they're trying to find any way to undermine our Western system of thought because it won't work with what they want to do. Continuing. Indigenous ancestral knowing. I mean, literally, they've just jumped right into this. Out of all the other ways of knowing, this is the one that catches their hair on fire. This is the one that they really are pushing to undermine Western civilization. That's just kind of what they're doing. So for native peoples, such as the Ojibwa, I should probably find somebody who can pronounce these, and the Choctaw of the author's heritage, indigenous or ancestral wisdom is a language still spoken. Its guidance is still heard. Ancestral wisdom exists across all cultures and people. Prior to the rising of the scientific revolution, ancestral wisdom was a critical aspect of experiencing and understanding the world. So they're kind of pissed off because old world pseudo-knowledge, or at least the things that they thought to be true, didn't really pan out when people became more technologically advanced and our understanding of reality increased. So some of these folk wisdoms went by the wayside because, like I said, they were like the god of the gaps. When you can't explain what's really taking place, you make up some bullshit. And once we actually figure out why things work, we discard the bullshit reason we made up for more reliable and scientific ways of discovering knowledge. And so they hate this. They just really hate this. Such common European American proverbs taught to us by our elders, such as a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, reference in the Hugh Rhodes The Broke of Nature or School of Good Manners. So this is back in 1530. So it's a deepity. I get what they're saying. Everyone kind of gets what they're saying. It's not science. It's not, I mean, I guess it's knowledge, but it's not, whatever, it's just like stupid. And most often interpreted as a meaning of encouraging us to recognize the value of what we have guided us for centuries, I guess. But we have better ways to discover knowledge now. But our current over-reliance on knowings, they did say knowings, born exclusively of Western scientific methodologies, has lessened, don't think so, the value of I do agree with this. It says, let's read that again. But our current over-reliance on knowing, that's really weird for them the way they're saying this, but our current over-reliance on knowings born exclusively of Western scientific methodologies has lessened the value of ancestral knowledge and the impact it had on creating meaningful community-based social change. So they really hate that Western science, which brings us to the discovery of truth, objective truth, counters a lot of what they're trying to do to undermine society. It's like when Marx was saying that like communism only works when nothing else can put a lie to it, and so the whole world has to be communist. If there are scientifically literate and technologically advanced societies out there practicing capitalism, where everyone is better off, your lifespan is longer, your health is better, you get your medicine because we have proper scientific methods for discovering new medicines. All of this stuff just puts a complete lie to their cult religion of communism. And Marx hated it. He absolutely hated it, just like these people do. While in Hawaii, working with a group of over 50 people from 10 different indigenous communities in North America and Hawaii, the importance of this way of knowing came to life before our eyes. We were gathered together to create ways to improve the educational experience among youth in these communities, from preschool through high school. It says the evening before our first full day, we came together for a cookout at the beach. That seems pretty nice. Playing games, cooking, and swimming together. That also sounds really cool. Building relationships. Nothing wrong with that. Extending our ohana in Hawaii. Ohana can mean family in a broad sense that includes blood relatives and adopted or international families. So ohana just means, I guess, your community that you're working with. So if everyone's nice and everyone's good people, they kind of become your family. Sure. Cool. It's awesome. The following morning, we did not jump immediately into current educational theories, test scores, or other sets of student or teacher data to learn about the educational challenges we each face in our community. Instead, we were first taken as a group to a place reserved for paying respect to the ancestors. I'm a teacher, so like, if I were on like, I don't know, like let's say I was going to Hawaii and I was supposed to be either helping them with their educational woes, or I was going there to learn new things about education, but on the taxpayer's dime, so I could bring this information back to be more effective as a teacher. And when I went there, what they did is, maybe there's some community building, which I hate that word, but sometimes they do icebreakers in that way. I'm not a big fan normally, but it seems to be what happens just to get people ready to start working together. Fine. But if they were then taking us as a group to one of their ancestral religious places to do some kind of religious ceremony, I wouldn't want to do that. It's not my jam. It says the native Hawaiian host group led a prayer ceremony in front of a native wood sculpture in which they welcomed their ancestors and asked them permission to bring the rest of the group into sacred land. I mean, I guess, if that's customary of what they do, I'd probably not put up a big fuss about it. But on the other side of it, it doesn't have any real meaning to me. I don't think any of that's true. I have no reason to believe any of that's true. I don't think that any of that is necessary. It may make the people doing the ceremonies feel better about themselves, but on the flip side, it's not going to change anything. But here they go. It says, most of the group had tears in their eyes as we listened to the prayer and songs spoken in the language a few of us knew. So it was more of an emotional appeal. That's a weird kind of grooming. So they're grooming adults into feeling a certain nostalgia about this people's way of life. Because it just says here they didn't know the language, so all of the songs and all this stuff was just an emotional appeal. It says we became vulnerable in front of each other. Wonderful. Which enabled an instant knowing of a deep responsibility we carried to both the past and the future, and to the children for whom we were imagining a better experience of public education. Now that's the bullshit. So all of this grooming of emotional, heartstring pulling may have felt warm and cozy and cuddly, but when they say, which enabled an instant knowing, oh fuck you, that's not knowing. That's just emotional manipulation. If you don't know the words to all of their rituals, you're not gaining any knowledge. So, I hate when they do this stuff. It says this knowing was named by almost everyone during the day's debrief, and it provided an undeniable current in the flow of our work for the rest of the week and beyond. We did not have to decide on centering, there's one of those words, centering this knowing as a priority to guide our work together. It was simply presented by the ceremonial practice of honoring and engaging ancestors. If I were there, I would have been kind of pissed off that they were wasting our time, especially if I was only there for a week and we had a lot to get done so that we could improve the educational system there. And these people were fucking around with doing ceremonies that people that aren't part of this whole practice see it as just a waste of time. Feel for the people, it's nice to know what people think, but they should ask us to do those things when we're not being paid and when we're not on the public dole. That's just ridiculous. If this was part of that whole engagement, I'd feel weird because I was sent there, like I said, by the public that's being forced to pay through their taxation of property taxes to pay for my salary, to have to sit through hours or even however much time it took for them to complete these ceremonies. No, that is unacceptable. So restorative justice incoming. So I gave myself a little note when I read this last time. So this is where the restorative justice, they're not going to say restorative justice, but restorative justice is a ridiculous concept. I don't even want to call it an anti-concept, a floating abstraction. This stuff doesn't work. It's not good. So here we go. Another example of drawing on indigenous ancestral wisdom and social justice work, or communism, where it comes from a client and partner in the field, Ifiteo Cultural Arts Academy, which supports the creative, educational, and professional development of youth and families of African descent in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and the surrounding communities. So Ifiteo honors the ancestors and elders through formal structures. For example, the Council of Elders. This is where the restorative justice stuff comes in. And through practices of concept drawing from African tradition, Mumbongi, which translates as a place of learning and is a community space where all people have the power to raise and discuss questions, concerns, conflicts, and reflections. Mumbongi is rooted in ancestral knowing of how to resolve conflict and innovate. Innovate what? Doesn't say. As described by Sandra Bowie, executive director of the Ifiteo Cultural Arts Academy. So here's a quick deviation. I'll tell you a story. I'm a teacher. I used to work at a high school, a pretty large high school, and the high school is very woke. what I came to find is that they really preferred these restorative justice groups. And here's some really perverse examples. So the community was mostly African American and Hispanic. There was few white kids and Asian kids, probably more Asian kids than white kids. And so sometimes the African American kids, obviously bringing weapons to school should be an expulsion, and the police should be involved. Due to their restorative justice practices, when kids of African American descent would bring in weapons, they would confiscate them, and then they would send them to this weird tribunal that they had on campus. And instead of bringing the law in, what they would do is they would just talk it out in one of these councils. The problem was that there were a ton of repeat offenders. There was a point where some of the kids were found with firearms, handguns on them, and those were confiscated and then later given back to the kids when they left school that day. I didn't find this out until much later. And then those kids that weekend with those same firearms were committing a home invasion in the area and were killed by the homeowner in self-defense, because those kids were emboldened to go into that home with the guns that they were caught with at school. That was ridiculous. It was swept under the rug. Another time there was a white kid in my class who was very nice. He was, I think, over 18, probably been there too long. He was very poor. He lived in, I think, like a 2-bedroom apartment with his parents and then siblings that were a little bit older. They were not quite, they were old enough to not get into his stuff and hurt themselves with his things. And because this kid was probably like 19, one weekend he went to the flea market and picked himself up a pocket knife. Later that weekend, he had relatives come over with their very young children, and so to keep the kids from getting to the pocket knife, he put it in his school bag, his only bag he had, and he hung it up high in his closet so that there wouldn't be a problem. Needless to say, the kid came to school on Monday and forgot that he had his pocket knife in his bag, and so another child actually saw the pocket knife, had a meltdown. The school police came, and this kid didn't get to go through the restorative justice program. The cops took him away and brought him to jail because he brought a weapon on campus. He was an African American, he was a white kid, and so they didn't just take his pocket knife and give it back to him at the end of the day and tell him not to bring it back. He went to jail, and then he was gone for a very long time, and then he got bail, was back in school. Then they ended up convicting him, and I don't know if he went to long-term jail or if they put him in prison, but he did not get restorative justice. They refused to use the tribunal on him. I'll let you kind of put some of this together. So a lot of this jaded me towards any of the social justice movement because, like Animal Farm, all the animals are equal, just some animals are more equal than others. That's the grift. Mbongi is a practical example of how youth are able to exert their perspectives alongside adults by calling the community together to address problem solving, and the community is obligated to respond. Each person's voice is valued and taken into consideration in open, honest, and authentic ways. I don't see any problem with everyone getting a voice when there's some kind of conflict, but trying to use this in a school situation can help when people are just disagreeing about something. But when kids bring weapons or are actually harming other kids physically or mentally, to use this instead of more scientific methods is negligence. I think it's child abuse. All right, through Mbongi, Ifatoyo is able to develop a comprehensive, systemic understanding of issues and can come together to agree about desired actions. It has helped Ifatoyo to build a strong community, develop leaders who can encourage in courageous conversations. Oh, that's another one of those disgusting buzzwords. And enhance all aspects of its work programming into operations. Sorry, I just got stuck on that courageous conversations. Seems like they bring that up anytime you know that what they're saying is bullshit. And so you have to have a courageous conversation, which means you have to let them basically, it's sophistry. They have to be able to lie to you, and you just have to sit there and take it. And because they get the power, because stuff. We are now on to spiritual, natural knowing. Our access to understanding is most often rooted in smile and metaphor, imaginative capacity of language. We understand the movement of blood in our veins and arteries through descriptions of rivers and their tributaries. We describe complex social systems through their natural corollaries, trees and their interconnected root systems, wetlands and the delicate interdependence of their plants and animal species. We understand our connection to the earth and its sentient tapestries through the increased or evident impact of our destructive behaviors on every living thing around us. The land, sky, water, glacial mountain peaks, and through the impact of our environment, we begin to understand the impact of ourselves. So spiritual beliefs and practices throughout the world are also rooted in an understanding that there is something larger than this. Let's see where this goes. For those who resonate more with an agnostic or atheist belief system, justice itself becomes sacred. Why? They don't explain. It's just the word justice to them doesn't really mean anything, but when they start attaching words in front of it like social justice or economic justice, it becomes something different to them. Then it becomes sacred. They're actually telling you right here that this is part of their religion, critical Marxist religion, cult religion. Pamela Standing, here's that lady again, says, "We always begin with a prayer. If we are working with communities, what we are doing is sacred." To prepare herself for such sacred work, Standing invites spiritual help each day, asking to have what I need to live in a good way, to remember what it is that I am putting my hands to today. It's a weird way of putting that. And today, to do so with reverence and care. Without this, she says, we are missing the help that is available to us. There is something bigger than us that we need to listen to, whose support we can draw on and form. Oh, that was uninformative. Artistic knowing. This is where shit pisses me off. So I'll try to get through this without cussing too much. So poetry is not a luxury. It is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams toward survival and change. First made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible actions. Audre Lorde from the essay Poetry is Not a Luxury, first delivered an address at Mount Holyoke College in 1978. We create representations of our experience through story, visual arts, movement, music, in order to understand them as well as to help others understand them. These different ways of knowing, I fucking hate that, it says, these different ways of knowing lead not only to fuller knowledge of self and others, they also lead to alternative perceptions, apprehensions of the truth, and ideas and actions for addressing our shared challenges. Epistemology can be created around objectivity. And so, like I said before, what that really means is that knowledge is a thing outside of the human, and that humans, or any sentient being that has rationality, can discover that truth, and that becomes what we call knowledge. And so when they start talking about this stuff as if though we can use the visual arts, movement, and music in order to understand, let's see what they say, in order to understand them as well as to help others understand them, there's nothing wrong with that. When I listen to Beethoven, it's a reflection of well-crafted music. And when I think of Western musical systems, I think of resonance, like the resonant frequency of solid bodies. When they strike and you have an overtone series that can be observed, and it can be observed anywhere in the world. Anybody observing it, when you strike an object that's solid and you listen to it intently, or you use machinery to pick up the different waves in that resonance, we have a harmonic series. And then when you look at what Western music came of as a result of that, regardless if they knew it originally, but a lot of when we were building our Western music system, these things did play a role in why in the West we chose to use particular notes. So when I listen to Beethoven, it is a reflection of objective truths about science. It's knowledge in many ways to me. So I don't see any difference. But when they start talking about these different ways of knowing lead not only to the fuller knowledge of self and others, they're not really different ways of knowing. They're just a different way of getting to knowledge. But that's not what they're talking about here, and it's really gross. All right, it says they also lead to alternate perceptions, apprehensions of truth, and ideas and actions for addressing our shared challenges. So they're trying to use music as manipulative to get you to think about what they believe is true. Remember, these are postmodern Marxists where there is no objective truth. It's all your own personal truth. They want you to accept their personal truth. They're going to be using music and art as a way of trying to convince you that this is true, even though they don't believe in truth. It's kind of ridiculous. All right. Artistic knowing leads to different results. Artistic knowing leads to different results. Don't like that. So the Thousand Currents, formerly International Development Exchange, or the IDEX, partners with funders and donors to provide flexible small grants to effective locally based organizations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America led by women, youth, and indigenous leaders. Cool, I guess. In the summer of 2015, Thousand Currents began an artist in residence program with Shannon Bridgeforth and Ami Osun, Joni L. Johnson, who offered theoretical jazz as a tool for improvisation, creativity, and innovation. They brought together the staff, guiding them through creative processes. Through their work and organization, Sharon Bridgeforth sees people creating experiences of love by being together, relinquishing some aspect of identity in order to find it. They are, in fact, building community, and in the process also accessing the freedom to have their own experience. She says, allowing there to be many truths. There's the kicker. This is where shit gets weird. They want there to be many truths. That is their entire goal. Bridgeforth notes that recognizing our humanity is a necessary condition of leadership and works with whole people. There's that word, whole people. Anytime you hear whole anything, you should perk up your ears and be like, that sounds fucking Marxist. Because it is. In this way, actually it's Freire. If you don't know who that is, educational pedagogist that destroyed education in Brazil and was chased out, came to America, and Isaac Gottsman, the critical turn in education, so much to talk about. But whenever I hear whole language, all of this stuff basically means failed education. That's kind of what I've associated with. And Freire was a Marxist. Who would have guessed, right? So whole people in this way creates the necessary humility in folks. Ugh, there's that word, folks. This is another one of those dog whistles to the Marxists. They use folks instead of people. We introduce people more deeply to each other so that they can work together differently. What's different is that when we are whole people doing this work, doing Marxism, we are fully present with everything we've got. We cannot present and be hidden at the same time. Wow, they're actually talking about a contradiction here. That's kind of not what these people normally do. So hiding and the presence are not simultaneous truths. And it's only when we come to social change with our whole presence that we can heal and transform our world. So whenever they talk about transformation, what they really want to do is subvert the Western system because it comes to actual knowledge. And so it puts a lie to the things that they want you to believe are true. They really just want to get to communism. The whole point is to disrupt and dismantle everything that is the West because they hate it in hopes that out of the burning ashes, communism will reveal itself. Part of their religion. That's what the cult tenet really wants these people to do. Praxis. Beginning creative and culturally based strategies for teams and organizational development led to unexpected but welcome outcomes. The staff believes that the form and practice they are engaged in together, which includes creative writing, music, and movement, enables them to learn a lot about vulnerability, courage, accompaniment, and joy. Staff shared. Raising resources is not easy. Building alliance, there's another word, building alliances, and deepening relationships take time. At the same time, there are all sources of joy. If we emphasize on the joy, we will move forward and more creatively with our work, shedding the martyrdom sometimes inherent in our nonprofits. We committed and recommitted to great joy in all we do as a tribe, to our partners, our ancestors, and our collective strength. Whenever we hear all of these kind of buzzwords, it's all about communism. Thus, they see an increase in their vulnerability and a deep awareness of their own humanity, which is critical to how they approach their work. Yes, they always want to criticize everything. It's a big part of their work. Here's a crazy name. It says Rajiv Kahana, director of the philanthropic partnership at Thousand Currents and the executive director of Thousand Currents. Rajavini Bahini, I can't pronounce these names. Ansil, whatever. Herself, a longtime poet and former member of the Poet Active, June Jordan, Poetry for the People, agree that there has been a difference in how they do their work. In addition to the greater self-knowledge and knowledge of one another, the process has grown. Thousand Currents leadership and team capacity as well. In addition to the greater self-knowledge and knowledge of one another, the process has grown. Thousand Currents leadership and team capacity as well. The organization has begun embracing cultural, indigenous, ancestral, and artistic ways of knowing alongside or even instead of those rooted in the U.S. dominant culture. So they're basically saying they've abandoned reason and science, and what they would prefer is indigenous, ancestral ways of knowing instead. I don't know how that's a sustainable model for business, but I mean, all the power to them. This shift has caused the Thousand Currents to dramatically change its strategy, shift its theory of change, and re-envision how it goes about its work of advancing change in the world. All right, we're getting to some of the end here. So it says, reclaiming and sharing our multiple ways of knowing. So like Bonsil, looks like Bonds, I don't know, Bonsil. Both authors have a long-standing creative practice and in fact met in a jazz poetry class many years ago. Despite long-standing artistic practice, we found ourselves creating separation between our artistic pursuits and our leadership development work in the US-based nonprofit. Somewhere along the way, we had to come to accept the dominant Western idea that art lived in one house and theories of change, logic, and models and principles of leadership lived in another. They hated that. So the limitations of this separation became pronounced as one of the authors began reclaiming her artistic knowing by bringing creative writing and media arts to youth and leadership development methodologies. This led to an exploration of what it means to bring what Brian Hall termed ritual communication into leadership development work. Hall roughly defined ritual communication as skills with and use of ritual, archetypal symbols, and the art of communication medium for making meaning and raising critical consciousness, there's that word, of complex issues or awareness of transcendence. So they're basically trying to use art to bring us a critical consciousness, which basically means brainwash you into thinking like a critical Marxist. Disgusting. All right. From his decades of work with individuals and organizations, he viewed this as an essential part of education, learning organizations. This is very Ferrerian too. I can't believe they're getting away with this kind of stuff. People don't see this. We've increasingly seen the presencing of ritual to facilitate meaning-making and healing in a number of social justice spaces. While this is a long-standing practice for indigenous communities and communities of color, it was mainly something shared only within one's own community. Over the last few years, broad coalitions of social justice actors have come together in order to address complex social justice issues, and in doing have opened up spaces for sharing of multiple realities and experiential truths. Gross. There are no multiple realities. There is only reality. But if you're these kind of people, they don't know how. They don't know what's actually true. All they know how to do is break shit and tear things down and disrupt stuff. And so they can't actually pinpoint something and say, that is true. For those of you who follow James Lindsay, one of his explanations for this practice is that anytime you decide that you have the truth, or anytime you become the center of power based on how you see the world as being true, you become the dominant power structure. In Marxism, especially this new neo-Marxist ideology of critical Marxism, you have to start destroying yourself. They don't want to do that, and so they have to basically be open to multiple realities and experiential truths. So they can't tell you how things should be done. They just have to keep destroying things in hopes that one day out of the ashes will rise this god of communism. It's really a disgusting religious practice. So that we might move forward together to illustrate the shift, dignity, and power now. A Los Angeles-based criminal justice reform organization and network has a director of health and wellness who leads their building resilience work. Another Los Angeles organization is the Youth Justice Coalition. These are all Marxist organizations. Engage in a combination of rituals such as altar building and mural creations that honor young people of color lost to violence. If you remember back in the summer of love in 2020, the altar building and the mural creations, I know BLM loved their mural creations. This was to honor people lost to violence, colored people lost to violence. I think that was one way to start building this up in people's minds as a legitimate organization, even though, as we know now, it had nothing to do with legitimacy. It says rituals are rooted in African and Indigenous American traditions and draw on the support of our ancestors in order to increase community cooperation. Let me read that again. It says rituals are rooted in African and Indigenous American traditions and draw on the support of our ancestors in order to increase community cooperation and engender mutual abundance. So these are some ways that they use to brainwash people into their ideology. Generalized knowing. Oh boy. More deeply presenting foundational and artistic ways of knowing does not lessen the value of generalized and practical knowing. So now they're trying to conflate the idea that all of these types of knowing are actually equal in their validity. And anyone who understands the difference between science and folklore will know that this is bullshit and that it's a contradiction in terms. You can't have contradictions. And so generalized knowing is drawn from patterns and repeated experiments. Yeah, that's probably the most efficient way of discovering knowledge. It includes concepts, theories, logical models, and promising practices, because, they are the promising practices. It says, for thousand currents, drawing on generalized knowing means lifting up the wisdom, insight, and experiences of their partners in the field and learning from them. Oh, here's that name again. Asba Hansil observes, I don't know how to say that name. It's the social movement and grassroots organization that actually do the terrific work that's reflected in our theory of change. Oh, this theory of change shit's scary. It says, in creating a theory of change, Thousand Currents wants to surface what they do from the perspective of their guarantee partners, fine-tune what they say they do and how they represent it, and they choose what they were committed to continuing doing and measuring. So both theory of change and evaluation are examples of generalized knowing and provide critical insight into strengthening efforts to affect transformative social change. So they're trying to use all of this stuff to transformative social change, which means brainwash you into Marxism. So this theory of change. So all of this stuff is kind of coming together as a theory of change so that they can affect transformative social change. That's some scary shit. So to surface what they are doing, Thousand Currents did a series of interviews and surveys with guarantee partners, as many researchers' projects do. What's different about this project, though, was how it evolved to be a real relationship with the foundational and practical and even artistic knowing of their guarantee partners, bringing multiple ways of knowing to bear in their ongoing theory of change process. So they have to bring all of this and conflate and confuse people by pretending like there is multiple realities, that there's multiple ways of knowing which are contradictory. All of this stuff is to basically create a brainworm in your head that eats your consciousness and rationality. No thanks. I think I'll not do that. So theory of change methodology was introduced to Thousand Currents by longtime funder and consultant Cherie Tung during the learning and evaluation journey. According to Tung, I don't know, Thousand Currents theories of change was developed as a tool for learning, identifying patterns, conducting experiments, and making adjustments. It helps the organization have a coherent conversation about what and how it thinks about the world in which it operates, the context it finds itself in, and the assumptions it holds. So it knows that it can't get anything done without using liberal Enlightenment values and scientific methods. But on the flip side of it, they only use that just enough to make sure that they don't go under, while using these other kinds of knowledge that are all bullshit, generally, unless they really point to scientific facts. Those are the ones that they're going to conflate this whole thing with to confuse the fuck out of you, so that you end up promoting and paying these people, giving money to their nonprofit. As Tang says, we don't often have the opportunity or on a weekly or even monthly basis to say to each other, hey, I'm doing these things because I'm assuming these things. We don't often pause and consider why we do what we choose to do, or why we do some things over others. I think they do, but maybe these people are just so high on smelling their own farts that they don't really know. I doubt that, though. I think that they realize exactly what they're doing. I think it's evil. So 1000 Currents got to what they thought was the end of drafting their theory of change and were ready to share it with the world. Staff had some reservations. Well, of course they did. So this name again, reporting with a laugh that they were complaining that the theory was too linear and didn't reflect the adaptive and flexible ways that the organization actually worked with partners. So they were being too honest, and so they knew it wouldn't work. They knew that their partners would see through the bullshit. So they paused and went back to the stories they heard, and through these stories were able to create an artistic accompaniment to the theory that reflected the theme's more holistic approach. When the founders of the Thousand Island, Paul Strasberg, first saw the comprehensive theory of change, he remarked, "This is an experience-based model, a model that has grown out of our own continuing trial and error experiments over decades. It's not a hypothesis to be tested, but really a culmination of experience with a higher probability of success than other models that have dominated the fields." Wow. So practical knowing. So I think we're getting towards the end of this. It says, being in a learning community is different than being in a community of practice. So this is their praxis, where they have to take their religious doctrine and bring it into practice all the time. So a community of practice is about the learning from the doing, not the learning about doing. So this is Normal Wong. It says, this idea of our organization and networks being communities of practice that unfold from and in mutual relationships with our foundational, artistic, and generalized knowings is one of the reasons that 1000 Currents, as well as name again I'm not going to say, reports. So this is a big part of their praxis. It says, our theory of change is affecting everything from how we do work plans and reporting with our guarantee partners, to our internal programs and grant making processes, to our new capacities building and alliance building that we have signed up to be accountable with measurable outcomes, to our internal budget processes. This is where alignment comes in from our experience through to our actions. So even these organizations realize that all the bullshit that they're spewing has to still be accountable. Otherwise, all the people that have been giving them money are going to start questions. Like BLM, they missed this step, and so they screwed up because they ended up using all the money for nefarious things generally. And when you look at all the things that they were buying, the money that was being squandered, these organizations are even more nefarious because they realize that they can't do that kind of thing. All right, we're at the conclusion. Knowing will be more valid, richer, deeper, more true to life, and more useful if our knowing is grounded in our experience, expressed through our art. This is understood through theories which make sense to us and expressing in worthwhile action in our lives. So Peter Reason, it's kind of funny they'd use Peter Reason, make this sound a little more reasonable than it is. So the University of Bath, so it's 1998. So here it is. With our clients and partners in the field, we continue to engage in practices that bring forth multiple ways of knowing. Through this, we are creating space for all of us to bring our full selves to the table so that together we can continue to, in the words of Dr. King, bend the long arc of history towards justice. So they want to not bring it towards justice. What they want to do is bring down justice so that they can have a power grab based on all of the bullshit we just got done listening to. So as our understanding and practice deepens, the possibility for justice seems within closer reach. That's creepy. Well, that concludes this article, but yeah, so for any of you who are interested where this came from, so this is actually coming from a site. I'm going to do some more of these readings because I find it super, super creepy. So this comes from a website called nonprofitquarterly.org, and a lot of the things that they talk about is racial justice, economic justice, climate justice, health justice, and there's a bunch of different articles about all this stuff. I'm kind of curious if their health justice is like what James Lindsay was talking about, the Lysenkoism. I don't know. I'm going to get into this. I have a lot of articles coming up, so hopefully this wasn't too boring. I had fun kind of reading through this. I end up doing this after work, and so I do work a lot of hours, and then I try to come home and do some of this at night as a way to relax. So I'm going to go and listen to some of the editing and listen to this again and see if it actually makes any sense. But to me, this stuff is scary. I read a lot of these articles, and if this stuff isn't brought to the surface and people start to hear what's going on in these radicalized religious communities, we're just going to have to keep fighting this. This stuff is going to be it's already worked its way into the school system. It's worked its way into the political systems. If they have their way, they'll bring America and all of our constitutional values and rights to the ground. They'll burn it to the ground in hopes that they can get rid of America, which is the lie to their system. If America is existing, what they want to bring in will never look good. Communism will never look good. So they have to get America out of the way. They have to definitely erode our individual rights. And one of the ways of doing that is to make you think that an objective epistemology doesn't exist and that there's many ways to know what they think of as truth. To them, truth is made, not discovered. Knowledge is made, not discovered. And if you allow them to do it to you, I guess in many ways you deserve it. But I don't want to live in that world. I won't live in that world. I'm going to continue fighting. See you in the next one.